Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to go through the exercise steps of Rewst 102. And as we do, we'll highlight some key concepts. Let's go ahead and get started. And as always, thank you for watching. So in this video, we're going to highlight three things. The first thing is creating a form. The second thing is creating a workflow. And the third thing is where when we submit the form, it will start the workflow. Let's go ahead and see how to do these things. We're going to first start off by creating the form. To do that, we're going to head over to Automations, followed by Forms. Once we're here over at Forms, I'll go ahead and click on the plus button on the right-hand side. To create a form, we first got to give it a name. So I'll name it Demo, Add or Remove from Azure AD Group. And I'll also throw form at the end, just so that I know that this is a form, even though this is in the form section. From here, I'll go ahead and click Submit. Once we click Submit, it'll bring us over to the workflow editor. And this is where we can start adding various fields to create our form. So we know we're going to need three fields. We'll need a user field, a group field, and a field to add or remove that user from the group that we select. So let's start with the user field. We'll use a drop-down. Click and hold, drag and drop. Adds the field. When clicking on the field, it brings us the various options of the field. I'm going to start with the field label. The field label is what we see on the UI side, what the text of the form will actually display. So I'll type user, and you'll see that the field label changes, and you can see that represented over here. Next, we can add a field description. This will be subtext below the field label. So I'll enter choose a user for the description, and you'll see where the field description goes. And the last thing we're going to be adding is a field name. So what the field name does is create a variable. When we select a user from the dropdown, the value of that user will be stored in the field name, which is again a variable. So let's give a field name of user_ID. We'll say this is a required field, so you have to fill it out in order to submit the form. Next thing down here is we need to populate the field with a number of options. So the easy way to do this is dynamically by asking Microsoft Graph to give us all the users that it has. Let's see how to do that. So the first thing is to toggle the dynamic options. We'll then scroll down and select Integrations, and I'll search for Microsoft Graph. Once you find Microsoft Graph, go ahead and select it. And then we're going to ask for users. So clicking on the Resources dropdown, followed by Users. So populating the field with users from Microsoft Graph. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for groups. So drag and dropping another dropdown. And this time, this is going to be for groups. So I'll start up here for the field name. I'll call this group ID. For the field label, I'll call this group. And then for the description, we can say choose a group. We'll then select required. And then we'll again use Microsoft Graph to populate this field with the groups that it has. So we'll toggle dynamic options. Under integrations, we'll look for Microsoft Graph. And then for resource, I'll select groups. So once we select a group from this dropdown, it will store the value of the group in the field name or variable called group ID. Last thing we need is the action, whether we are adding or removing the user we selected to or from the group we selected. So to implement that, I will use radio buttons, and I'll drag and drop that field onto our workflow editor. From here, following the same motions for the field name, I'll call this action. For the field label, I'll call it add or remove. That's pretty descriptive, so I'll leave the field description alone and then checking the box for required. Since there's only going to be two values, add or remove, we can leave the dynamic options alone. It's simple enough for us to implement by ourselves. So I'll go ahead and remove one of the placeholder values. The first option label, I will type add, and then the option value will also be add, but lowercase. Second option label, we'll call it remove, and then the value will also be remove, lowercase. So what will happen is when the person filling out the form selects add or remove, it will correspond to the option value for add or remove. That value will then be stored in the field name, which is a variable called action. Now that we've finished creating the form, let's go ahead and save. So I'll click on the save icon up here at the top right, followed by submit. And we have finished our first step of creating the form. Next, we're going to go ahead and create the workflow, which is again the steps that our automation needs to take in order to automate our task or our process. Let's go ahead and head over to the automation section. And then under the automation section, we'll select workflows. Once we're here under workflows, I'll head over to the right and click create. We need to give our workflow a name. I'll call it demo, add or remove from Azure AD group. And once we have a name entered, we'll go ahead and click submit. Now that we're on the workflow editor, we're going to take a look at the various actions that we can use for our automation to function. Under the search bar, the first action we're going to be looking for is called a no-op. I'll go ahead and add a no-op to the workflow editor, like so. And let's talk about what the no-op does. So just looking at the description, we'll see that a no-op doesn't do anything. So the natural question will be, well, if it doesn't do anything, what do we have a no-op for? And while there's a number of use cases for the no-op, the one that we're going to be honing in on is within these rectangles here called transitions. So to go from one action to another, we transition into them. And we can set a number of conditions to control how the transitions work. So we'll highlight these 4 conditions, and these are again all related to the action that the transition is connected to. So the first condition is on success. So if the action that the condition is connected to runs successfully, then we will follow this transition wherever it leads to. The next one is on failure. So if the action that the transition is connected to fails, then we can have this transition wherever the transition connects to. The third one is always. This is regardless of whether the action is successful or fails, we'll go ahead and transition to whatever the transition is connected to. And the last one here is custom conditions. This is where you can specify what conditions you want to check for. And based off of the conditions, we can then transition to another action. So a lot of what the no-op allows us to do is implement that type of custom conditions within the transition away from other actions. So let's go ahead and see how this works. Right now in the workflow editor, what we'll be implementing is adding a user or removing a user from a group using Microsoft Graph. So over on the left-hand side, I'll search for graph, followed by add, and then it'll show me add group member. So I'll go ahead and select add group member, drag and drop it onto the workflow editor. And then to connect the transition to an action, we can click and hold the gray arrow and then drag it to the action that we want to transition to. And then if you want to edit that, you can drag it back in like this. But we'll go ahead and connect my current transition of my core no-op over to this action to add a user to a group. So we're going to head back over to the no-op. So I'll name the no-op something more descriptive, add or remove. And then I'm going to click on this transition here. For the custom label, I'll label it add. And then for the condition, we're going to be selecting a custom condition. The logic that we want to implement here is checking that action variable that we created over at the form. We'll say if the action variable is equal to add, then we will follow this transition over to the action it's connected to, the Microsoft Graph add group member. So let's see how to implement that custom condition. We'll click on the Jinja editor. We also call it the Jinja burger. So this will be the first time we see Jinja. In the 103 course, we'll dive into much more detail of the mechanics and the syntax of Jinja. But for now, let's go ahead and implement it, and we'll talk about what's happening in Rewst 103. So Jinja is all about curly brackets. So to start off, we're going to use 2 curly brackets. When I hit the spacebar, it'll autocomplete for me. Our variables live in this place called the context. All of the variables in the form that we've created will end up in this place called the context. To access those variables in the context, we will type ctx in all caps, followed by a dot. And in this case, I want to check the action variable to see if it's equal to add. So we'll look for the action variable like this. We'll compare the action variable to the value add using 2 equals. And we're looking for the value add like this. So access in the context, the variable action, and check to see if the value of action is equal to add. We'll close this out. And if this custom condition is true, then we will follow this transition over to the action that it's connected to. Before we implement the transition for remove, as well as the Microsoft action for remove, there's a couple of things we'll implement first. Let's head up and click on the pencil icon up at the top. Once we click on the pencil icon, there's a number of settings that we can configure. The one I want to highlight first is this time saved. This is the amount of time you would expect a normal everyday person to accomplish the task that this workflow is going to complete. So I'll enter something like 5 minutes or 300 seconds, and every time this workflow runs, it will keep track of the total amount of time saved. What we can configure in a workflow is the inputs that we expect to come in and the outputs that we expect to leave the workflow. So this becomes extremely important when we look at the concept of sub-workflows in Rewst 106. For now, we're going to be configuring the variables or the inputs that this workflow is expecting and that we're going to need in order for this workflow to run. So let's go ahead and configure those input configurations. And the 3 that we need are going to be our action variable, user ID, and group ID. Let's go ahead and specify those. So first one here, I will start with the action. And we'll say that is required. We'll also say I will need a user ID. And I will say that is also required. And then the last one we're going to be needing is the group ID. We'll also say that's required. So for now, we're saying these are the variables that I need in order to run. And we know that these variables will be coming from the form. Once we connect the form as a trigger, we'll then have everything we need for this workflow to run successfully. Once we have all of that squared away, we'll head down towards the bottom and click Submit. And skipping ahead a little bit, I'll go ahead and connect our form with the workflow. So we're going to head up to Add Trigger. And we'll first need to give our trigger a name. I will call it Form Trigger. I'll then toggle the Enabled. And then we're going to look under Trigger Type. When you click the dropdown for Trigger Type, it will show you all of the different actions that can happen among your integrations. So when we select one of these trigger types and the action occurs, it will then start our workflow. So the trigger type we're looking for is a form submission, and that's under the core section. So I'll select core form submission. Once we select that, we're going to need to select the form itself. So under trigger parameters, I'll click on the drop down. And if on your end you don't have a lot of forms, it should be pretty easy to look for. But if you do have a lot of forms, you can start typing and it will search for forms in that way. So we'll select the form that we created not too long ago. And then down at the bottom, we'll go ahead and click Submit. And just like that, we've connected the form that we created to the workflow that we created so that when the form is submitted, it will start the workflow. I'll click on the gear to clear out the view that we have and bring us back to the workflow editor. And the last thing we're going to do before testing all of this out is implementing the remove transition from our add remove no-op and implementing the remove group member. Let's start with the transition. So right below the no-op, we'll click on this plus button that will create a new transition. From here, we'll click on the on success transition, give it a custom label. I'll call it remove. And then the condition that we're going to be setting is just like the add. In this case, we're going to be checking the action variable to see if it's equal to remove. We'll go ahead and click on the custom condition. We'll click on the Jinja editor or the Jinja burger. 2 curly brackets followed by a spacebar to autocomplete. And then we're going to access the action variable from the context. So ctx dot. And you'll notice that when I hit the dot, it autocompletes. So by entering the input configurations, it allows us to autocomplete based off of what we put in those input configurations. So we're looking for the action variable, and we're checking to see if that is equal to the value remove. Once we have that entered, we'll go ahead and close this out. Move over to the right a little bit, and then we're going to be looking for the Microsoft Graph action to remove a group member from a group. From here, I'll select remove group member, drag and drop it onto our workflow editor, and then connect the transition remove to the action remove group member. So the no-op is helping us with our custom conditions. It's helping us check to see what the value of that action variable is. And depending on what the value is, it will then transition to the actions that it is connected to. Now, in order for these actions to work, you'll notice that we need a couple of parameters. And that will be coming from the variables that we specified in the form. So let's start with the group. So just like we did with the action variable, we'll be doing the same thing for the group ID variable and the user ID variable. So 2 curly brackets, ctx to access the context, followed by the group ID. And that will give us the value of the group ID variable. And let's do the same thing for the user ID. So 2 curly brackets followed by a spacebar, access the context variable called user ID. And like that, it will give us the value of the user ID variable. When I say context variable or variable, they're referencing the same thing. We'll go ahead and do the same thing over on the add group member. So we'll go a little bit quicker here. Jinja editor, 2 curly brackets, ctx dot group ID. And then same thing for the user ID, ctx dot user ID. And then we'll close this out. And just like that, we've implemented our MVP of our use case. Now to see the form in action, we'll go ahead and click Publish at the top right, followed by Submit. This will solidify all of the changes that we have made in the workflow. Now to access the form, to fill it out, what we're going to do is click on the gear at the top. And when we click on the gear, it will give us the URL of the form that is connected to this workflow. To see that URL, we're going to be clicking on View Direct URLs, and then we'll click on this link here. It opens a new tab and gives us the form to fill out. Let's go ahead and see it in action. We'll click on the user dropdown, and it should populate with the users coming from Microsoft Graph. I'll go ahead and select CLUCK Norris. From here, I'll select a group, and then I'll select something towards the bottom here. And add or remove, I'll go ahead and select add. And from here, we'll go ahead and click Submit. And we'll see our form submitted successfully. So let's see how we can see the results of the form once we submit it. I'm going to head back over to where my workflow is. We'll clear out this pop-up box. And there's an icon here that looks kind of like a graph. When you click on that graph icon for View Results for Workflow, it will show you the results of the workflow, whether it succeeded, whether it failed, and which tasks have completed successfully. If you click into it, you can see the details of the workflow's execution. In Rewst 103, we'll do a little bit more investigation of what we see here. And you'll also notice on the form as well, when I'm selecting a user and selecting a group, it's a little tricky because this list of groups are all of the groups. So just by looking at this, I don't know whether CLUCK Norris is a member of any of these groups or not. And because of that ambiguity, when I add or remove, it might create errors if I'm already a member of a group or if I am not a member of a group. In Rewst 104, we'll make some enhancements to the form so that we can make that differentiation. But again, here in Rewst 102, we highlighted 3 things: how to create a form, how to create a workflow, and how to tie the two together by having the form trigger our workflow. Within that form, we also saw how to pull data from the form in our workflow. So I want to thank you for watching. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us on Discord or leave a comment in the comment section. I want to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.